soft spot for indie horror games. Not only do I have immense respect for the developers who create these projects on passion alone with little to no budget, but I also genuinely think that it can be an even more effective way to tell stories than AAA games that are often restricted by corporate red tape. And what I think is even cooler is how these games have changed and evolved over the years, the patterns that we can see emerging, and what that says about our collective societal psyche. In fact, I bet that by looking at all of the most successful indie horror games over the past 20 years or so, I can tell you exactly what the next indie horror games to blow up will be. But while I love watching horror games, I'm way too much of a foos to play them myself. So I brought in someone who's played more than their fair share of indie horrors over the years. You might call him somewhat of an expert. Helping me out today is Tom from Game Theory. How's it going, Tom?
Hi, Anna. Yeah, you know, I'm doing all right. I've just recovered from sickness, but my voice is back, so I'm so excited to be talking with you today. But other than that, yeah, just, you know, keeping busy as always, because a theorist's work is never truly done.
Well, I'm super excited to have you. Alright, so Tom, down to business. You've been in the indie horror scene for quite some time, so what are some changes you've noticed in indie horror games within the last 5 to 10 years?
Yeah, generally I think the biggest change I've seen over the last few years is the change from more independent, unique games and sequels into a chapter-based system. Bendy actually did this back in the day. I think they were some of the first to do it. And so from there, you've seen a lot of these games, rather than telling unique individual stories that can fit together but are satisfying in their own way, these stories now tend to be more overarching, and so each individual chapter might not have a satisfying conclusion or like really fill you in on the full story because it's only part of the story. It's the chapter, it's a section of the full story. Now, there are some who manage to make each chapter uniquely satisfying, but I think that's just the general theme, and that actually makes it really hard for people like me or people like you who are trying to theorize about these things, because sometimes even the devs don't know where the story's going. They're kind of developing it as it goes. So that's one of the big changes, I think, is just that chapter-based system.
Yeah, I have noticed the move to chapter-based or episode-based games, and I can see the behind-the-scenes reasoning for it. It allows for much faster feedback and monetization. It potentially keeps the buzz going for longer than if they were to just release a game and then have that initial wave of interest come and go. And I think it even allows developers to adjust future chapters as they get the audience response from the previous ones, especially since devs these days are paying a lot more attention to audience feedback and theorizing. So the change makes sense from a developer standpoint in those regards, whether or not it's preferable for the audience, it's up for debate. But what other changes are we looking at?
Yeah, another change I think would be the change in gameplay, specifically the move to walking simulators. For FNAF, you were sat down in a room and had to survive. For Doki Doki, it was a visual novel, but then there was Bendy, which was a walking simulator, the idea that you're just walking through an environment and exploring this massive world. Now that's great for getting to see a big world, a big studio or an abandoned factory or whatever it is, and so there's some really cool like visuals you can have. But with that change, I've also noticed there's been a switch to a tell don't show style of storytelling. You know, you explore the environment and you get exposition dumps from radios or VHS tapes or notes that are strewn around the factory. The problem with that is you lose that intrigue from environmental storytelling. Again, back to original FNAF, you would sit in a room, and because you were stuck in one room, the environment had to tell you the story. You couldn't just explore and find notes. You were having to look at the posters. What are they telling me? What are the sounds I'm hearing? What are they telling me? And that environmental storytelling is so fun for theorizers. It's stressful and it's confusing because it's not clear as day, but I think we're starting to lean into more of the simplified, let me just tell you what is happening, and the more you go through, the more you unlock, versus can we put the pieces together like we did with old school FNAF?
True, a lot of games that have made it big recently have been walking sims. For those who don't know, a walking simulator might sound like a negative term, and some may use it as such, but it really just means a game where the primary gameplay is exploring a world, often interacting with things or completing puzzles, but usually with very little to no combat. I think walking simulators are popular in indie games because there's not really a skill barrier for casual gamers. Anyone can pick it up and play, and it's also likely just easier to make a game with no combat system that primarily focuses on storytelling, which is where indie games really shine anyway, in my opinion. Any other changes?
Yeah, there is one more that actually comes to mind. It's something I've talked about in a recent video, but it's the idea that indie horror has shifted into much darker, more real stories. It comes from the point of like, you know, the colorful spooky bear jump scaring you for the millionth time isn't really that scary anymore. So the industry has kind of shifted to focus more on darker, real stories, subjects like SA or suicide. It's a much darker take on things, and it gets that visceral reaction, makes us uncomfortable. But it's like the real world horror, I guess, at this point. That also mixed with PS1 style gritty graphics, things like Mouthwashing, really encapsulate that new era of indie horror.
And I love that that both touches on the themes around these games, their hearts, their interior, if you will, and how they present themselves, or their exterior. I'd love to delve deeper into the exterior for now, and see if we can find any more trends for how indie horror has evolved in that way over the years. Because in order to guess what's ahead of us, we must first look back. Hey yo, it's Big Frankie for Big Frankie's Playhouse Emporium, and today's video was sponsored by Incogni. I've been getting spam texts like crazy lately, and my nephew Antonio showed me the other day that when he Googled Big Frankie, my phone number came up. What? That's right, your personal information is being sold and published online without you even knowing about it, just waiting to be snatched up by scammers. That's where Incogni comes in. Incogni tracks down and removes your personal data from multiple sites, including online directories, people search sites, and even commercial databases. It's fully automated for hundreds of known data brokers, companies that collect and sell your data without your consent. And since your data can reappear on these sites, they repeatedly remove it for you. Well, you can ask these sites to remove it yourself. Getting through all that would take hundreds of hours, only for it to pop back up again later. So let Incogni do it for you. And now with the unlimited plan, they're offering unlimited custom removals. Here's how it works. If you come across your personal information online, you just copy the link to the website, give it to Incogni, and watch it disappear. This is in addition to the 250 sites they already have covered automatically. So take your personal data back with Incogni. Use code Goombanna deal at the link below and get 60% off an annual plan. Get over here. So to make it easier to see these trends, I did my best to compile a timeline of the most successful indie horror games over the past couple decades. But what defines a successful indie horror game? Let's break it down. Indie, a single developer or small team of developers working with little to no budget. This definition rules out games like Until Dawn or even PT, which was marketed as an indie game by an unknown studio, but in reality was developed by Kojima Productions and backed by AAA publisher Konami. Horror. I'm looking for games that kind of rely on the spooky factor. Something that claims itself to be a horror pretty much first and foremost and doesn't prioritize another genre of gaming. Cult of the Lamb may have dark themes, but it's more of a base-building roguelite. Inscription does have psychological horror elements, but I'd primarily classify it as a deck builder. Both incredible games that I absolutely love, but slightly missed the mark of what I'm going for today. And then successful was by and large the most difficult to quantify, mainly because unlike AAA games, sales of indie games are by and large kept under wraps. Like, there's no way to see how many copies of a game have been downloaded on Steam or anything. The closest thing I could get is that there does seem to be a correlation between how many reviews a Steam game gets to how many times it's been downloaded. And since almost all of the games I was looking at were on Steam, I decided to go by this metric, narrowing down my list of over 130 popular indie horror games by seeing which had the most Steam reviews. Now, this wasn't a blanket rule. Of course, I took into account games that weren't on Steam or ones that were added long after their initial release date, which was reflected in their review count. And maybe one or two slipped in because of my personal bias. But honestly, if I know the game well, it was probably pretty successful. Using that method, I was able to pare it down to just a few of the very top indie horror games for each year. So if your fave isn't in here, I didn't forget it, it just either didn't fit the criteria quite right, or the numbers just placed it below the listed ones. So, the history of indie horror games goes back farther than this, but I wanted to start at Yume Nikki from 2004 because it was an incredibly influential precursor to the RPG Maker horror boom. Yume Nikki is a super surreal game where a girl explores her dreams, and it's an early example of a game that handles themes of isolation, depression, and trauma. Its pixel art style and creepy atmosphere inspired not just the next batch of popular games, but modern games like Omori and Doki Doki Literature Club. It could also be seen as an early example of a walking simulator since there was no combat. What followed, though, is the first major wave that we can see in indie horror, the RPG Maker wave. With the new accessibility that RPG Maker 2000 and 2003 and its clones afforded game devs, we saw an explosion of story-driven horror RPGs like Aooni, Misao, Eve, The Witch's House, Mad Father, and may I just say, take me back! I loved this era. The scares were subtle yet effective, and they were able to tell such cool stories in these small packages. The wave we see after that coincides with the rise of gaming becoming popular on YouTube, and that's what I like to call the YouTube Jumpscare wave. The most prominent game that comes to mind for this era was Amnesia: The Dark Descent. Ironically, Aooni actually falls into this time period too, but even though it came out before Amnesia, the big YouTubers generally played it after they played Amnesia. During this wave, games that succeeded were ones that could generate big reactions from YouTubers, and this was often via jump scares. Also tucked into this era were a wave of games that spawned from creepypastas or creepypasta adjacent things, like Slender the 8 Pages, Jeff the Killer, which you get an artist's rendition of because I genuinely didn't want to look at the face while editing, and The Crooked Man, among others. Ironically, two of the most successful indie horrors in 2014 were made in response to the overly saturated jump scare era. Developer of The Forest, Ben Falcone, noted that the game started with his frustration at most of the things he was playing for the past few years, and noted that their game didn't have any jump scares. And Spooky's Jumpscare Mansion, originally Spooky's House of Jump Scares, was fully a tongue-in-cheek satire of the jump scare trend, but ended up getting popular on YouTube anyway, in part because of the jump scares. It's around this time that I would say indie horror entered a new wave. Not that jump scares or games getting popular because of YouTube's playing them ended, but I think after this it became much more a snake eating its own tail thing. YouTubers play popular games, and the YouTubers playing them makes those games more popular. But the key is that they were playing these games in that time period for the jump scares, and now the game substance can come from a variety of things. But 2014 brought about two new waves, both of which are still going strong today. The first, of course, was Five Nights at Freddy's initiating the Mascot Horror boom. Originally coined by John Wolfe, Mascot Horror is where a game takes a friendly-looking mascot, often in a setting aimed at children, and then subverts it with a horror atmosphere. Five Nights, Bendy and the Ink Machine, Baldi's Basics, Mr. Hop's Playhouse, Poppy Playtime, Garden of Banban, Amanda the Adventure, My Friendly Neighborhood, Indigo Park, and Julian and Friends. I skipped Choo Choo Charles because while he's clearly based on Thomas the Tank Engine, he's never presented in a non-monstrous form or in a kid-friendly atmosphere, so I don't think that technically falls under Mascot Horror, even if it's using the same appeal to nostalgia as the others. But the other trend that took off in 2014, and often overlaps with Mascot Horror, is what I call cute versus scary. This is also genre subversion, so you can see why many Mascot Horror games fall under this, but it's more general in that it includes any game that contrasts cute, colorful characters with a dark underbelly that's revealed once you start playing. We covered the Mascot Horror games already, but this would also include Spooky's Jumpscare Mansion, Frainbow, Pony Island, Sally Face, Doki Doki Literature Club, Hello Neighbor, Dark Deception. This one's on the edge, but they are using what would normally be cute things and set up some cute versus scary fake-outs. I would even say Murder House touched on this trend when introducing the Easter Bunny gimmick, Omori Cooking Companions, Kanito Pet, and My Side. I would argue that this cute versus scary trend is going even stronger than Mascot Horror still, but there were still other waves happening during this time that we have yet to cover. 2020 saw the rise of what I'll call a Twisted Mundane type of game. Chilla's Art was probably the first one to really launch this trend, and while they had made other games in the past, the convenience store was the first one that seemed to catch people's attention on a viral level. Chilla's Art games often follow a storyline where you are working a regular, mundane job when something goes horribly wrong. The convenience store, the closing shift, parasocial, the bathhouse. Hence, Twisted Mundane games set things up like you're going to do an everyday mundane task and then flips it on its head. Other games outside of Chilla's Art that do this are going to buy some milk in Milk Inside of a Bag of Milk Inside of a Bag of Milk, working a lookout in the Fears to Fathoms games. Even working a shift at the morgue and the mortuary assistant, as non-mundane as we might find it, is still this sort of clocking into work sort of a deal. During this same time period, we also saw the rise of PSX or PlayStation-style graphics, like Tom pointed out. The first game on our list to do this was actually Babysitter Bloodbath by Puppet Combo, which the devs of Fears to Fathom and Mouthwashing credit as inspiring the style of their games. Rail, the developer of Fears to Fathom, also credits Chilla's Art alongside Puppet Combo, and it was really when the convenience store came out that we saw widespread use of this art style in games like Murder House, also developed by Puppet Combo, all the Fears to Fathom and Chilla's Art games, Iron Lung, Signalis, Crow Country, and Mouthwashing. In addition to the Twisted Mundane and PSX waves, 2020 also saw an explosion of horror co-op games becoming hugely successful. Yes, there were already successful co-op games like The Forest and Dead by Daylight previously, but it was nothing like since 2020 when Phasmophobia was released. After that, we got Devour, Inside the Backrooms, Lethal Company, Content Warning, and Repo, among others. I would be really surprised if this wave wasn't correlated to the pandemic, where we had to find new ways to connect to our friends while having to stay inside. Even after 2020 and 2021, there was a huge shift to working remote, communicating with people via Zoom or other online methods, just a move to connecting in isolation in general. And YouTubers and streamers could take advantage of the more isolated lifestyle we tend to live and still collaborate with others, especially via in-game proximity chat. There's also been a shift towards co-op games that are purposefully trying to incorporate humor. In Phasmophobia, you could create humorous situations, and sometimes the movement jankiness of the game would be humorous, but I don't think they were trying to make a funny game. But compare this to Lethal Company, that included dancing, Content Warning, where you type your own face and had meta commentary on getting footage for SpookTube, and Repo, where the characters are purposefully designed in a funny way and it tasks you with trying not to break expensive things. One thing I've noticed throughout the entire timeline of indie horror is the use of nostalgia. And yes, this comes in the form of several Mascot Horror series playing off of shows and settings from many people's childhoods, Chuck E. Cheese, Dora the Explorer, Sesame Street, etc. But this also includes graphical art styles that are meant to emulate games of the past. That wave of PSX-style games, appealing to nostalgia. Even games that use a pixelated art style are appealing to nostalgia, because even the earliest ones on that list were using it as a deliberate choice as opposed to it being a result of the limited technology of the 80s and 90s. We've also got games that utilize analog horror, like VHS tapes or grainy filters. We've got modern FMV games that harken back to the FMV games of the 90s, games that draw from 80s slashers, and games that are designed to look like early computer games of the 90s and 2000s. And it's interesting, you can line up the timeline of when these mediums were most popular to where they fall on this timeline. It's not perfect by any means, but that could also in part be because developers can have a wide age range between them. But look how many games utilize nostalgia in one way or another. We'll talk more about that in a bit, but first, we've covered the patterns we can see in the packaging of these games and the exterior, but now we've got to look at the hearts of these games and see if we can find patterns in their themes. As you said, Tom, game stories have been getting more overtly dark over time. Yes, there were early games like Yume Nikki that dealt with darker themes, but a lot of times this was covered in symbolism. I think you pointed out in your video that the Five Nights at Freddy's series deals with child kidnapping and worse, but we never see those things. But more and more you see games very brazenly just sort of leaving it all out there. And I have a couple theories of why games are getting more and more openly dark, but they're two very different branches that I want to address separately. So if we're talking about dark themes revolving around violence or torture or things of that nature, I think a big part of it is society becoming desensitized to that type of violence and graphicness. I mean, as the internet has grown and people have had more and more access to disturbing subject matter and the dark, shadowy places of the internet Mufasa told me never to go to, at a younger and younger age, it only makes sense that a graphic scene that would have caused outrage in the 90s doesn't cause anyone to blink these days. I mean, consider the fact that true crime podcasts skyrocketed in popularity in the 2010s, particularly hitting a growth point when the podcast Serial came out in 2014. You combine people's morbid curiosity with developers needing to one-up their competition, and you get really dark stuff. Or other stuff, in the Coffin of Andy and Lele's case. Hey, against all odds, I've never actually touched Homestuck, but I feel like this is like the edgy Homestuck of the 2020s. Can anyone who knows Homestuck tell me if I'm on the money there? I think I am. Then the other separate branch is if we're talking about dark things revolving around mental health, depression, anxiety, etc. While there are likely parallels to my previous point of the internet providing more access to these types of stories and experiences, I think it's the much lighter side of that coin in that mental health is becoming less stigmatized. Instead of feeling the need to hide poor mental health or mental health disorders, people feel more free to talk about it or express their experiences and feelings in games. Milk Inside of a Bag of Milk Inside of a Bag of Milk definitely portrays extreme anxiety, and many people believe it might be portraying a neurodivergent perspective as well, and I just don't think you would have seen this type of game in the early 2000s. But how cool that we can see it now! So while these stories can be painful due to their nature, I do appreciate the benefit of these things being more openly talked about. There are a few other recurring themes I've noticed in recent years that track with societal concerns. One that I've only noticed in a couple of games, but could definitely see there being more of in future games, are games with themes of the loss of innocent times. Going back to The Coffin of Andy and Lele, released in 2024, Ashley has an obsession with holding on to her and Andrew's childhood personas, and desperately fights against Andrew trying to shake off the past. And My Friendly Neighborhood, released the same year, opens up with an example of how jarring and bleakly dichotomous media can be, and is about the children's educational show My Friendly Neighborhood being permanently shut down due to wartime, leaving everyone jaded. To continue this kinda bummer train, another theme I've picked up recently is a highlighting of the unbalanced power dynamic that women often face in the world. Nearly all of Chilla's art games have you playing as a female. Obviously, a female main character is nothing new to games. But as I mentioned when talking about the Twisted Mundane games, oftentimes the situation in these games is that you're working, and it highlights the more recently discussed issue of women in particular being subject to unwanted advances at best while they're stuck working. Or in Parasocial, the fear that many female creators have of being stalked when they're just trying to do their job. When it's unrelated to work, simple things like commuting turn into potentially dangerous events, even if they don't always result in something happening. A lot of women call Chilla's art games being a girl simulators, because they do a really good job of replicating how on your toes you have to feel so much of the time. Fierce to Fathom has adopted this as well, going on a trip with a male friend and having it turn into a situation where you feel cornered, not knowing who to trust. There are other games that show this power imbalance as well. In Mouthwashing, Anya, the only female crew member, feels like she can't speak up for herself, and without spoiling too much, her issues get downplayed in part due to a male bond. In My Side, Mita is well aware of not only her role as basically a virtual girlfriend, but she's also aware of everything the player experiences in their world, but she lacks, like an outside. Another emerging theme that might not surprise too many people is the self-realization of computer software and AI. The first really notable example of this being Doki Doki Literature Club, but we also saw it with Buddy Simulator 1984, Signalis, Kanito-Pet, Indigo Park, My Side, and Julian and Friends. I could definitely see this theme continuing on as games come out. There are two more prevalent themes that I think I can already see poking through in some games. One is the paranoia and isolation brought about by the COVID pandemic. One example of this is in, once again, The Coffin of Andy and Lele, where they are quarantined after being tested during a parasite outbreak. While they're being held in their apartment for months, workers are supposed to drop off food, but they never do, and the two siblings are constantly on the brink of starvation. While displayed in its most extreme form, this fear likely stems from when people were facing shortages while quarantining during the pandemic, at times unable to get food or toilet paper. When something as base of a necessity as toilet paper is unavailable to you in a time of crisis, that feeling is a powerful one that I am not surprised to see manifest in modern games. And if you're in doubt that this portrayal was in any way inspired by COVID, they literally use the word quarantine. And when was the last time you heard the word quarantine prior to 2020? Maybe in a hospital? In a zombie apocalypse movie mayhaps? But let's be real. No, I'm Not a Human is another that I think likely draws from COVID in a much more subtle way, in that it's about isolating from the rest of society due to dangerous visitors coming up from the ground and posing as humans, and then deciding who you let into your house based on whether or not they display increasingly unreliable identifying visitor signs that are broadcast to you on TV every day. The whole staying away from people and trying to decipher who's safe and who's not based on signs that we're hearing new things about every day, it gives early COVID vibes. No, I'm Not a Human also brings us to our last theme, distrust in authority. As I mentioned, the signs used to identify visitors that are supposedly passed along from a higher authority aren't always accurate. And what's even more shady is that the Federal Emergency Management Agency, or FEMA agents, keep taking people from your house for tests and never bringing them back. So it's set up to make you question the whole system running things. The Coffin of Andy and Lele, Crow Country, and Mouthwashing also convey stories where the corporations and people in charge fail the ones they're supposed to protect. I also want to quickly mention that I am super aware that many of these games were developed overseas, and I recognize that I have an American lens, and am definitely not trying to prescribe that perspective to these games or their developers. Nor am I trying to make any sort of statement about any country. I do think that COVID and worldwide government tensions in general probably affect the zeitgeist of everywhere to some degree, and I don't think that a US perspective on these games should be completely discounted, considering each of these games were successful in part due to the US audience. So clearly something resonated with us, and so that's more what I'm looking at. Thank you for coming to my TED Talk. Okay, we've looked at the patterns of different types of games over the years, and we've looked at the patterns of themes in games over the years. So now, taking what we've seen so far, let's see if we can't predict what the next successful indie horrors will look like. First of all, Tom, do you think there's a secret recipe to a successful or viral indie horror game?
Well, the short answer is yes. I do think there are differences between the games that do blow up and don't blow up. There are small things like make sure your characters are simply and colorfully designed. That helps with things like putting them in a YouTube thumbnail. It makes them instantly recognizable, makes people want to click, but also it means that fans can draw them. If a fan is able to draw them, they become like almost intrinsically more involved in that franchise, which helps it live long term because people can make their own, people can animate their own stuff or draw fan art, and it becomes a much bigger thing than just here's a game, enjoy it. There's also things like making sure you're leaning into nostalgia. Poppy Playtime is a toy factory. Garten of Banban is a kindergarten. It's that sense of leaning into locations that we remember from our childhood, but giving it that eerie twist. But, of course, the biggest thing, and the thing I think we're all expecting me to say, lore. Obviously, lore is such a crucial part of these mysteries. We're always wanting to have a compelling story, something that will leave us asking questions going forward. That's what builds theories, and that's what keeps conversation going even between releases of sequels or chapters or whatever you want to talk about. If a game has lore that is too simple or it's like fully explained, so if you collect all the notes, the lore is just solved, there isn't a mystery, then people get bored, there's nothing more to talk about, and so people move on, and that franchise will die very quickly. On the flip side, though, if your game is too complicated, you end up in a similar situation because the lore is too hard to put together, and fans leave out of frustration. FNAF has actually kind of reached a point where people are getting so frustrated at how complex the lore is these days, but because while it was complicated, it felt solvable in the early days, people are still kind of ingrained in it, but if a newer franchise comes in and it's too complicated, people will just give up. If a game becomes too dark, it alienates the younger audiences. I know there are people who get frustrated over FNAF being for kids or Mascot Horror being kiddie horror, and I recognize that, but you've got to look at it from the idea of a success standpoint. It actually really helps a franchise have longevity. Most of the people that are now like theorizing or making content or enjoying FNAF in their 20s grew up with it 10 years ago when they were 10. Whereas if you make something that can really only be enjoyed by adults, there will still be people who attach to it, but you just may not have that longevity in the same way. But of course, the final and most important thing is originality. You have to have that sense of uniqueness. So many games these days feel like copy pastes of one another, from the locations to the characters and the story. Like how many times we talked about Dead Kids, like those sorts of things start to feel repetitive and so feel boring. And so it means that I go, oh, this is a Poppy clone, this is a FNAF clone, and people don't feel like there's anything unique about it to make me like this over the thing that it's copying. So you need to have something that stands out. Again, if you look back at old indie horror, think of the differences between FNAF, between Bendy, between Doki Doki Literature Club. Those are three very distinct examples, all indie horror and very successful, but their uniqueness is why they stand out to this day.
I love that the first thing you said was making sure your designs work well for thumbnails, because obviously with our jobs, that's where our minds are at. But it also speaks to the fact that getting YouTubers to play a game, for better or for worse, is probably the #1 marketing strategy for indie devs these days. But I also think what you said about originality is super important, because when people hear that YouTubers playing their games is the best advertising, the natural inclination is to turn to what's already been successful in the past, jump scares, Mascot Horror, etc. But people are much more attracted to originality, especially YouTubers who've been playing these games for years and have seen the same thing time and time again. Standing out in a highly saturated market is key. In fact, if you look at our timeline of successful games, those that didn't fit neatly into any particular wave or trend all had something that set them apart from other games at the time. Limbo with its black and white silhouette aesthetic. Soma had the leg up of being by the same developers as Amnesia, but it brought to the table a profoundly existential storyline exploring what it means to be human. Oxenfree brought with it a distinctive 2.5D art style and dialogue system that flowed with the gameplay. Devotion was steeped in Taiwanese culture and tradition. Love Sam explored the story being told purely through diary entries, so on and so forth. So while I don't think we're done seeing Mascot Horror or jump scare based games, if they're gonna be successful, they need to bring something new to the table. Like Tom said, the games that do things differently are the ones that stand out. Okay, I think I'm ready to make some predictions, but I think I gotta break them up into different categories since we've explored so many different types of patterns. Let's do predictions based on themes, predictions based on nostalgia, and predictions based on game type. For all of these, these, I'm trying to think both of what developers that are currently adults might be inspired by and what younger future devs might be inspired by. And Tom, I'll let you go for this so you're not shackled to my predictions, but thank you so much for helping me out with this. You've been invaluable. If they want to see more of your stuff, where can they check you out?
Yeah, of course. You can find me obviously theorizing away about all these indie horror games over on the Game Theorists YouTube channel. But if you just want to hang out with me as I play some games live, you can join me over on Twitch at Dapper Mr. Tom or on YouTube at Dapper Mr. Tom Live. Thanks so much for having me.
Bye! Okay, so we'll start with theme predictions. In the nearer future, I very much see some of the themes we touched on before continuing. AI self-realization, a distrust of authority or government, games centered around mental health, and a loss of a more innocent time. I'll also add in a spreading disease or contagion as a result of the COVID pandemic. I'm not talking anything as vague as like zombies, I'm talking actual disease. These are the most prevalent themes that I think that current adults have been struggling with as of late. The themes that I believe are most prevalent to younger people that we'll see coming through in games later on are extreme isolation, both in that spending parts of childhood or adolescence in quarantine separated from peers is going to have some sort of effect on the psyche that will manifest, and in that bullying is a huge problem in adolescence, especially with the ability to do it online now, so a social isolation in that regard. And speaking of, generations are now growing up online and with social media, which my heart goes out to teenagers having to grow up with the social pressures and comparing and competition of social media. And I don't really care if it makes the video longer because I just want to say this. In a world that wants you to compare yourself with others and billion-dollar industries and influencers that make money convincing you that you're not good enough or don't have enough, I know it's impossible to shut it out completely, but just try to remember that that's what's happening. Listen to me. You are good enough as is. How people portray themselves online is curated and never the full story. Someone else can be good too, and that doesn't dull your shine, and people sell you things by convincing you otherwise. 2 TED Talks in one video, it's impressive. But I brought this up to say that this, plus the societal pressure to present the best version of yourself online and never do anything wrong in fear of cancellation, plus sprinkling on a fear of stalking and doxing, will lead to a prevalent theme of being watched and heavily scrutinized. The final, more specific theme that I could very much see coming up is school shootings, feeling unsafe in a school environment. Now, this, and a lot of this stuff, is dark, and I can see what Tom was saying about stories that are more abstract and less overtly dark performing better and resonating with younger audiences more. And honestly, I can see this abstraction or surrealism or symbolism occurring not only because it's easier to monetize and more digestible for younger audiences, but because it can provide escapism or catharsis without directly triggering anyone. And because it's very possible that these feelings are easier to express in the abstract rather than verbalizing them. I do think we're gonna get plenty of really brazenly dark stories still because of the mass desensitization and the need to one-up the previous thing that I mentioned before, but I could see some abstraction on the horizon. On to predictions based on nostalgia. As we covered, appeal to nostalgia is found all over the place in indie horror. But what will be nostalgic in the future is an interesting question. If we're talking nostalgia around media consumed as children, I had to pull in even more experts in the form of people younger than me. Look, if we're getting games based on Thomas the Tank Engine and Dora the Explorer, I gotta ask what shows younger people grew up with. So I asked my cousins, shout out Michael and Matthew, what shows they watched when they were younger, giving my examples of Barney, Sesame Street, or Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood. And surprisingly, there was a lot of crossover. Or maybe not so surprisingly, considering these are long-running successful shows, and often we find the media we watch as kids through our older siblings or cousins or what our parents know. They mentioned others I was familiar with, like Curious George, Blue's Clues, Bob the Builder, Little Bill, and Yo Gabba Gabba, which I think could easily be made into horror games, but successful ones? Unclear. One also mentioned Word World, which I didn't know, but upon looking it up, I'm not entirely convinced that my cousin's not secretly an indie horror dev already. But none of these seemed quite unique enough. Yo Gabba Gabba is too much like Poppy Playtime, Little Bill is interesting because of its almost paper collage-y style, and I think the closest thing that I can think of that matches is The Night in the Woods, which wasn't horror enough for this list, but is it unique enough? Not sure. I was really looking for that special sauce, something original, something that felt fresh but nostalgic and a little bit eerie at the same time. And then I saw a pattern that I thought was really interesting. The ones my cousins mentioned that caught my attention the most were Umizoomi, Wonder Pets, Lazy Town, and The Amazing World of Gumball. Why? They all used mixed media. Umizoomi combined cute little cartoons with real footage. Wonder Pets uses photo puppetry and drawn objects to create something that's kind of unnerving. Lazy Town intertwines real humans and puppet humans, and The Amazing World of Gumball overlays animation on top of photorealistic backgrounds. I think these mixed media shows have that perfect mixture of nostalgia and unsettlingness, and I have yet to see an indie horror master this medium, so that's going on the prediction list. If we're talking about an even younger generation's childhood shows, I'm a little out of my depth, but I know Peppa Pig, Bluey, Blippi, and Miss Rachel. Of those, I think the most unique would be a play on Blippi or Miss Rachel's show. Like something that involves a YouTube show with a real actor would be kinda cool. If we're talking about nostalgia based on spaces or locations, like how Five Nights at Freddy's plays off of the nostalgia and eeriness of Chuck E. Cheese, I would say I could see malls being seen as creepy by a younger generation. And honestly, I would say abandoned virtual spaces. Like, I know RuneScape has had a slight comeback, but I could see younger folks being real unnerved by like an empty OG RuneScape landscape. Or abandoned Roblox lobbies. And the solitude of playing Minecraft solo lends itself well to a horror environment too. Finally, let's make some predictions based on game type. I definitely predict we'll see more successful co-op games that feature proximity chat and lean heavily into humor. Graphically, the natural evolution after pixelated games, PSX graphics, and early computer game low poly graphics would be GameCube graphics? Something like Time Splitters 2, Harvest Moon: A Wonderful Life, or Eternal Darkness: Sandy's Requiem. But I'm not entirely convinced, because while earlier indie games were inspired by the graphical limitations of mainstream games, now indie games are inspired by other indie games. Like, remember how I mentioned Rail, the developer for Fears for Fathom, being inspired by Chilla's art for that VHS analog horror look? He was born in 2001, and I could be wrong, but I don't think he ever watched a VHS tape. But he still associates the VHS look with being creepy because of past indie games. So I think pixelated and PSX games haven't run their course yet, but I could see the further growth of low poly games. From a technical perspective, I think that AI will be incorporated in more games, so I could see that being used to make Uncanny Valley humans. And I'm speaking from a purely realistic perspective regarding the use of AI in games. Morality aside, making new technology easily accessible to the public is like squeezing toothpaste out of a tube. You can't put it back in. And I know that AI has been in games to control enemy behavior and whatnot, but you know what I mean. So, to sum it all up, theme predictions? Sooner. AI self-realization, distrust of authority or government, mental health disorders, the loss of a more innocent time, and a spreading contagious disease. Later, extreme social isolation, being watched or heavily scrutinized, and feeling unsafe in a school environment. Nostalgia predictions: mixed media shows, YouTube shows, malls, abandoned virtual lobbies, and a Minecraft-esque environment. And game type predictions: comedic horror co-ops, low poly graphics, and uncanny humans created with AI. But the most important aspect of what will be successful in the future is originality, which is the only factor I can't predict. If I could, I would be a game developer. But both present and future indie developers, you got this. Creating something that's never been made before is an incredibly daunting task, but just keep in mind that we want you to succeed. We're all rooting for you, and I can't wait to see what you make. And also hire me as a voice actor. Thank you. But I want to know, what are your predictions for future indie horror games that are going to blow up? And did you see any other themes in the most popular ones of the past couple of decades that I didn't mention? Try to avoid saying major spoilers for recent games in the comments, though. I want to thank Tom again for being a guest on the channel. Links to his stuff will be in the description, and I hope you consider subscribing for more ridiculously profound and profoundly ridiculous questions about video games. Now, if you'll excuse me, I need to go return the soapbox I rented out for my TED Talks. But I'll see you on the next one. Later!
Goombanna is the wonder why she didn't come to play. Gaming vids that'll make you laugh and think and put them on replay. Intelligent, kind of funny, her community's #1. Stick around and kick your feet up. Goombanna has just begun.